sun dipped low in the sky, casting an amber glow over the sprawling countryside. The road to the castle was winding and narrow, flanked by dense, dark woods that seemed to whisper ancient secrets. A group of tourists, a disparate mix of thrill-seekers, history buffs, and the occasional skeptic, chatted excitedly as their van approached the imposing silhouette of Castle Ravenswood. The castle loomed on a hilltop, its stone walls weathered and gray, turrets reaching toward the heavens like skeletal fingers. Ivy clung to the walls, adding a touch of eerie beauty to the ancient fortress. As the van drew closer, a hush fell over the group. The air grew colder, and an inexplicable sense of dread settled in their chests. "Looks like something out of a Gothic novel," murmured Sarah, a literature student with a penchant for the macabre. Her eyes were wide with a mix of awe and apprehension. "Or a horror movie," added Tom, her boyfriend, attempting a chuckle that came out strained. The van came to a halt in front of the castle's massive wooden gates. Their tour guide, an elderly man with a thick accent and a face lined with the wisdom of years, stepped out and gestured for them to follow. "Welcome to Castle Ravenswood," he announced, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Built in the 13th century, it has witnessed countless events, some glorious, some tragic. Tonight, you will have the privilege of experiencing its history firsthand." The group exchanged nervous glances but followed the guide through the gates. The courtyard was vast, with cobblestone paths leading to various parts of the castle. An ancient fountain stood in the center, its water stagnant and covered in a thin layer of moss. "This way," the guide said, leading them toward the main entrance. As they crossed the threshold, a cold breeze swept through the hall, extinguishing the torches that lined the walls. The sudden darkness elicited gasps and nervous laughter. "Nothing to worry about," the guide reassured them, relighting the torches with practiced ease. "Just a draft. These old castles are full of them." Inside, the castle was a labyrinth of narrow hallways and grand rooms, each filled with relics from a bygone era. The walls were adorned with tapestries depicting scenes of battles and feasts, their colors faded but still vibrant enough to hint at the castle's once glorious past. "This is the Great Hall," the guide announced as they entered a vast room with a high vaulted ceiling. Long tables stretched across the floor, and at the far end stood a dais with an elaborate throne. "Legend has it," the guide continued, "that the lord of the castle still haunts this room, forever tied to his throne by the weight of his misdeeds." A shiver ran down Sarah's spine as she gazed at the throne. It was easy to imagine a spectral figure sitting there, watching them with cold, unseeing eyes. Their guide led them up a spiral staircase to the guest chambers. Each room was furnished with antique furniture, the beds draped in heavy velvet curtains. "You'll find your rooms comfortable, if a bit old-fashioned," the guide said with a wry smile. "Rest well tonight. Tomorrow, the real tour begins." As the group dispersed to their rooms, Sarah lingered in the hallway, staring out of a narrow window at the darkening sky. The sense of unease had not left her. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Come on, Sarah," Tom called from their room. "Let's get settled in." With one last glance at the shadowy courtyard below, Sarah turned and joined Tom. As she closed the door behind her, she felt a chill settle in her bones, and the ancient stones of Castle Ravenswood seemed to whisper a warning. The night had only just begun. The rooms of Castle Ravenswood were indeed old-fashioned, filled with heavy wooden furniture and draped in dark, rich fabrics. Sarah sat on the edge of the four-poster bed, running her fingers over the intricate carvings on the bedposts. Tom was busy unpacking their bags, trying to inject some normalcy into the eerie setting. "It's just an old castle," he said, glancing at Sarah. "No need to be so spooked." Sarah forced a smile and nodded. "You're right. It's just my imagination running wild." As the evening wore on, the group reconvened in the great hall for dinner. The long tables were set with heavy silverware and candle holders, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The meal was hearty but simple, a reminder of the castle's medieval roots. Their guide regaled them with tales of the castle's history, from grand feasts to bloody battles, each story tinged with a hint of the supernatural. "As you retire tonight," the guide said, his eyes glinting in the candlelight, "remember that this castle has seen many souls pass through its halls. Some say not all of them have left." The tourists chuckled nervously, but the unease was palpable. After dinner, they bid each other good night and retreated to their respective rooms. The hallway seemed longer in the dim light, and the silence was almost oppressive. Sarah and Tom settled into their room, the heavy drapes drawn tight against the cold night air. They tried to distract themselves with a book, but the strange noises from the hallway made it difficult to concentrate. It started with a faint whispering, just barely audible over the rustling of the wind outside. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Tom nodded, putting down his book. "Probably just the wind." But the whispers grew louder, turning into indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from all directions. Sarah's heart raced as she strained to catch the words. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the room, making them both jump. "What was that?" Sarah gasped, clutching Tom's arm. "Stay here," Tom said, his face pale but determined. He grabbed the flashlight from his bag and opened the door, peering into the dark hallway. The beam of light swept across the stone floor, revealing nothing but empty corridors. "I don't see anything," Tom said, stepping back into the room. "Let's just try to get some sleep." Reluctantly, they climbed into bed and turned off the light. The room was plunged into darkness, the only illumination coming from the pale moonlight filtering through the gaps in the curtains. Just as Sarah was beginning to drift off, she felt a sudden, icy chill at the foot of the bed. "Tom," she whispered urgently, "there's something here." Tom sat up, squinting into the darkness. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and the air seemed to hum with a strange energy. Before he could respond, a shadowy figure materialized at the foot of the bed. It was a man, his features obscured but his presence unmistakable. He stood there, staring at them with hollow eyes. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she fumbled for the flashlight. When she finally managed to turn it on, the beam cut through the darkness, but the figure was gone. The room was empty once more, the oppressive chill lingering in the air. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Tom nodded, his face grim. "We'll talk to the guide in the morning. Maybe there's some explanation for all this." But as they lay back down, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than before. Sleep was impossible, their minds racing with fear and questions. The night stretched on, each minute feeling like an eternity. In the other rooms, the rest of the group was having similar experiences. Shadows moved where no one stood, doors creaked open and shut on their own, and faint, ghostly figures appeared and vanished in the blink of an eye. By dawn, the entire group was exhausted, their nerves frayed by the relentless hauntings. As the first light of morning filtered into the castle, Sarah and Tom sat up, their eyes red-rimmed and weary. They had survived the night, but the real horror was just beginning. The spirits of Castle Ravenswood had made their presence known, and they were not about to let their visitors go so easily. The morning brought little relief. Pale and weary, the group gathered in the great hall, the night's terrors etched into their faces. Their guide, noticing the anxiety among his charges, raised a hand for silence. "Last night was merely the beginning," he said solemnly. "Today we delve deeper into the castle's history. Follow me." He led them through a series of narrow, twisting hallways, each turn bringing them further away from the light of day. The air grew colder and damper as they descended a spiral staircase that seemed to go on forever. At the bottom, they stood before a heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron bands. "This," the guide announced, pushing the door open with a creak that echoed ominously, "is the dungeon." The group hesitated before stepping inside. The room was a stark contrast to the grandeur of the castle above. Rough stone walls oozed with moisture, and the floor was slick and uneven. Rusty chains hung from the walls, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the air. "It was here," the guide continued, "that many unfortunate souls met their end. Some were prisoners of war, others victims of the Lord's wrath. Their suffering left a mark on this place, one that lingers to this day." Sarah shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. She could almost feel the weight of the prisoner's despair pressing down on her. The group spread out, examining the grim relics of the past. Tom found an old, leather-bound diary half buried in a pile of rubble. The pages were brittle and yellowed with age, but the ink was still legible. "Listen to this," he said, gathering everyone around. "It's a diary of one of the prisoners." He began to read aloud. The diary belonged to a man named Edric, who had been imprisoned for defying the cruel lord of the castle. His entries detailed the brutal torture he endured, the hopelessness that consumed him, and his desperate pleas for mercy. "I can hear them," Edric had written in shaky script. "The voices of those who suffered before me. They whisper in the dark, their agony a constant reminder of my fate. I fear I will join them soon, my spirit forever bound to this cursed place." As Tom read, the air grew colder. The faint sound of weeping seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The group exchanged uneasy glances, their breath visible in the frigid air. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. The guide nodded gravely. "The spirits of the tortured souls are never far. Their suffering binds them here, seeking release or revenge." Suddenly, the sound of chains rattling filled the room, and the temperature plummeted even further. Ghostly figures began to materialize around them, their faces twisted in pain and sorrow. The group huddled together, their fear palpable. One of the spirits, a gaunt figure with hollow eyes and tattered clothes, stepped forward. His mouth opened in a silent scream, and his hand reached out toward Sarah. She staggered back, feeling an icy grip around her wrist. The spirit's touch was like a vice, cold and unyielding. "Help me," the ghost whispered, his voice a mere breath of wind. "Release us from this torment." Tom lunged forward, trying to pull Sarah away, but his hand passed through the specter's arm as if it were smoke. Desperation filled the room, the spirits pressing closer, their pleas growing louder and more urgent. "We need to do something," Sarah cried, her voice tinged with panic. The guide nodded, his face set with determination. "There's an old ritual, one that might free them, but it requires courage and sacrifice." "What do we have to do?" Tom asked, his grip tightening on Sarah's arm. "The chapel," the guide replied. "Meet me there at midnight. Bring the diary. It contains part of the ritual. Until then, try to stay together and stay strong." The group slowly made their way back up the staircase, the weight of their new knowledge heavy on their shoulders. The dungeon door slammed shut behind them, the tortured souls left to their eternal agony for a few more hours. As they emerged into the daylight, the castle seemed even more oppressive, its shadows deeper and more menacing. Sarah glanced back at the descending staircase, a chill running down her spine. The spirits had made their plight clear, and the visitors now carried the burden of their salvation. The night had been terrifying, but the real challenge lay ahead. They had to confront the castle's darkest secrets and find a way to free the tortured souls, or risk becoming part of the castle's haunted history themselves. As the day wore on, the group's tension only grew. They gathered in the courtyard, discussing the chilling events of the previous night and their encounter with the tortured souls. The promise of a ritual offered a glimmer of hope, but also filled them with dread. The sun was beginning to set, when Sarah noticed a figure standing by one of the castle's arched windows. She squinted against the fading light, trying to make out the details. The figure was a woman, dressed in a flowing white gown that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her back, and her pale face was turned toward the courtyard. "Do you see that?" Sarah asked, nudging Tom. He followed her gaze and nodded. "Is that one of the other guests?" "I don't think so," Sarah replied, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "She looks different." The woman in white began to move, gliding gracefully along the castle's parapets. Her movements were ethereal, almost otherworldly. The group watched in silence as she disappeared around a corner. "Who was that?" One of the other tourists, a man named Greg, asked. The guide, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "That is the Lady in White. Her story is one of the castle's most tragic tales." He led them to a secluded part of the castle, a small chapel nestled within the walls. The stained glass windows cast colorful patterns on the stone floor, creating an almost serene atmosphere. The guide gestured for them to sit. "The Lady in White," he began, "was once Lady Isabella, the daughter of the castle's lord. She was known for her beauty and kindness, but her life was cut short under mysterious circumstances. Some say she was murdered by a jealous suitor. Others believe she took her own life after a tragic love affair. Regardless of how she died, her spirit has never found peace." Sarah shivered as she listened to the story, the image of the ghostly figure still vivid in her mind. "She appears to some as a benevolent spirit, seeking help to find rest," the guide continued. "To others, she is a harbinger of doom, warning of the castle's dark secrets. It is said that those who see her are destined to uncover the truth about her death." As the group absorbed this information, the chapel door creaked open, and a cold breeze swept through the room. Sarah turned to see the Lady in White standing in the doorway, her eyes filled with sorrow. "She's here," Sarah whispered, her heart pounding. The Lady in White drifted closer, her gaze fixed on Sarah. She reached out a translucent hand, beckoning her to follow. Sarah felt an inexplicable urge to comply, as if the ghost was pulling her with an unseen force. "Wait," Tom said, grabbing her arm. "We should all go." The group rose to their feet, following the ghostly figure as she led them through the castle. They wound their way through dimly lit corridors and down narrow staircases until they reached a small, hidden room. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay was overpowering. The Lady in White pointed to a loose stone in the wall. With trembling hands, Tom pried it open, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside, they found a collection of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. Sarah picked up the letters, her hands shaking. She unfolded the first one and began to read aloud. The letters were love notes, exchanged between Lady Isabella and a mysterious lover. They spoke of secret meetings and a forbidden romance, but the last letter was different. It was a desperate plea for help, written by Isabella the night she died. She feared for her life, begging her lover to come to her aid. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she finished reading. "She was murdered," she whispered. "She knew someone was coming for her." The lady in white nodded, her face etched with eternal sorrow. She pointed to the final letter, where a name was scrawled in the margin. Lord Ravenswood. "The Lord?" Tom said in disbelief. "Her own father." The ghost began to fade, her figure becoming more transparent. She looked at Sarah one last time, her eyes filled with gratitude and pain. As she vanished, the room grew colder, and a sense of profound sadness settled over the group. "We have to tell the guide," Sarah said, clutching the letters. "He needs to know the truth." They made their way back to the chapel, where the guide was waiting, his face grave. Sarah handed him the letters, and he read them in silence, his expression growing more somber with each word. "Thank you," he said finally, looking up at them. "You have uncovered a dark chapter in the castle's history. Lady Isabella can now rest, but there are still many spirits here who need our help. Tonight, we will perform the ritual and try to free them all." As they prepared for the night ahead, the group couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface of the castle's mysteries. The lady in white had shown them a glimpse of the past, but the full horror of Castle Ravenswood was yet to be revealed. As dusk settled over Castle Ravenswood, the group gathered in the chapel, the weight of their mission heavy on their shoulders. They knew the ritual might be their only chance to free the trapped spirits and escape the castle's haunted grasp. The guide, holding the ancient diary and the letters they had discovered, began to prepare the necessary items for the ritual. "We must be vigilant tonight," he warned. "The spirits will not give up their hold easily, especially the warden. He was a cruel man in life, and his malevolence has only grown in death." The group exchanged uneasy glances, their fear palpable. Sarah and Tom stood close together, seeking comfort in each other's presence. As the guide laid out candles, incense, and the diary, a sudden chill filled the room, and the candles flickered wildly. "He's here," the guide whispered, his eyes darting around the room. "Stay close." A low, menacing laugh echoed through the chapel, sending shivers down their spines. The temperature plummeted further, and the air grew thick with an oppressive energy. The warden's spirit had arrived. The ghostly figure of the warden materialized before them, his eyes burning with hatred. His gaunt face was twisted into a cruel smile, and his presence exuded a palpable sense of dread. He wore the tattered remnants of his uniform, and his hands were stained with the blood of his victims. "Fools," the warden hissed, his voice dripping with malice. "You think you can undo my work? This castle is mine, and so are the souls within it." Sarah stepped back, her heart pounding. The warden's gaze locked onto her, and she felt an icy grip around her throat. She gasped for breath, clawing at the invisible hands that choked her. "Let her go!" Tom shouted, lunging forward. But his hands passed through the warden's spectral form, and he stumbled, falling to the ground. The warden laughed again, tightening his grip on Sarah. "You will all join me in eternal torment." Desperation filled the room. The guide, his face set with determination, began to chant from the diary, reciting the ancient words of the ritual. The candles flared brighter, their light pushing back the darkness. The warden's grip faltered, and Sarah fell to the ground, gasping for air. The ghost turned his rage toward the guide, his form flickering and distorting as he advanced. "You cannot defeat me!" The warden roared, his voice a thunderous boom. The guide continued his chant, his voice steady and unwavering. The air hummed with energy, and the warden's form began to waver, his anger turning to fear. "No!" the warden screamed, his voice echoing through the chapel. "You cannot banish me!" The candles blazed with an intense light, and the warden's figure was engulfed in a blinding glow. He writhed and howled, his form disintegrating into nothingness. With a final, anguished scream, he vanished, leaving the room in an eerie silence. The group stood in stunned silence, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The oppressive chill had lifted, and the air felt lighter, almost peaceful. "Is it over?" Greg asked, his voice trembling. The guide nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "The warden is gone, but our task is not yet complete. We must continue the ritual to free the remaining spirits." They resumed their preparations, the tension still thick in the air. As they worked, the guide explained the next steps of the ritual, detailing the incantations and offerings required to appease the tortured souls. Suddenly, a faint, sorrowful wail echoed through the chapel. The group froze, their eyes widening in fear. The remaining spirits had awakened, drawn by the ritual's power. "Stay strong," the guide urged. "We must finish this." The ritual continued, each incantation strengthening the protective barrier around them. The spirits pressed closer, their ghostly forms flickering in and out of existence. Faces twisted in agony and despair, they reached out, their voices a cacophony of mournful cries. Sarah's heart ached for the lost souls, their pain almost palpable. She glanced at Tom, who gave her a reassuring nod. They had to see this through, for the spirits' sake, and their own. As the final incantation was spoken, the air crackled with energy. The spirits halted, their forms shimmering with a soft, ethereal light. One by one, they began to fade, their expressions of anguish giving way to peace. The last spirit, a young girl with sad eyes, lingered a moment longer. She looked directly at Sarah, a silent thank you in her gaze, before dissolving into the light. The group stood in silence, the weight of what they had accomplished settling over them. The castle felt different, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. For the first time since their arrival, they felt a sense of hope. The guide smiled, his face lined with relief. "You did well. The spirits are free, and the castle's curse is broken." As they made their way back to the courtyard, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, Sarah took one last look at the castle. It no longer seemed menacing, but rather a place of history and redemption. The horrors they had faced were behind them, but the memories would stay with them forever. And as they left Castle Ravenswood, they carried with them the knowledge that they had not only survived, but had brought peace to those who had suffered for so long. The group awoke the next morning with a sense of cautious optimism. The previous night's ritual had been successful in banishing the warden and releasing many of the tortured spirits, but the castle's oppressive atmosphere lingered. Their guide assured them that the worst was over, yet the group couldn't shake their lingering unease. As the sun set and evening fell once more, the guide gathered them in the great hall. The ancient dining room, with its high vaulted ceilings and long wooden tables, had been set for a feast. Candlelight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and the air was filled with the tantalizing aroma of roasted meats and freshly baked bread. "Tonight," the guide announced, "we celebrate our success and honor those who have passed. It is tradition to hold a feast in the Great Hall, to remember the castle's history and those who lived here." The group took their seats, trying to relax and enjoy the meal. The food was delicious, a welcome change from the tense atmosphere of the past days. As they ate, the guide told stories of the castle's former inhabitants, recounting tales of bravery, love, and betrayal. But as the evening wore on, the mood began to shift. The shadows seemed to grow darker, and the flickering candlelight took on an eerie, almost sinister quality. The air grew heavy, and a sense of unease settled over the group. Sarah glanced around the room, her eyes narrowing as she noticed movement in the corners of her vision. Figures seemed to be appearing and disappearing in the shadows, their forms indistinct, but unmistakably human. "Do you see that?" she whispered to Tom, her voice trembling. Tom nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "Something's not right." Before they could react, the room was filled with a ghostly wind, blowing out the candles and plunging the great hall into darkness. The temperature plummeted, and the sound of ghostly whispers filled the air. The group huddled together, their fear palpable. The ghostly figures began to take shape, emerging from the shadows and approaching the tables. They were dressed in medieval clothing, their faces pale and lifeless. Some bore the marks of their violent deaths, while others appeared sad and forlorn. "It's a spectral feast," the guide whispered, his voice barely audible over the ghostly din. "These are the spirits of the castle's former inhabitants, reliving their final moments." The ghostly banquet unfolded before their eyes, the spirits reenacting scenes of merriment and tragedy. A lord and lady danced in the center of the room, their ghostly forms moving gracefully through the air. At the head of the table, a figure that could only be Lord Ravenswood himself presided over the feast, his eyes cold and watchful. One by one, the spirits acted out their final moments. A knight clutched his chest and fell to the ground, the victim of an unseen assassin. A young maiden wept as she was dragged away by shadowy figures, her cries echoing through the hall. A servant boy, no older than 10, stood frozen in fear as a cruel master raised a whip. The group watched in horror, unable to look away from the ghastly spectacle. The ghostly banquet was a grim reminder of the castle's dark past, a history stained with blood and suffering. Suddenly, the lady in white appeared, her ethereal form glowing with a soft, soothing light. She moved among the spirits, her presence calming them. As she passed each ghost, their expressions softened, and they began to fade, their forms dissolving into the air. The guide stepped forward, his face set with determination. "We must help them find peace. Recite the words from the diary, and offer a prayer for their souls." The group joined hands, their voices trembling as they recited the incantations from the diary. The air hummed with energy, and the remaining spirits began to fade, their forms growing fainter with each passing moment. As the last of the ghosts vanished, the candles flickered back to life, and the great hall was once again filled with light. The temperature rose and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The group stood in silence, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. "It's over," the guide said, his voice filled with relief. "The spirits have found peace." The group exchanged weary smiles, their fear giving way to a sense of accomplishment. They had faced the horrors of Castle Ravenswood and emerged victorious. As they made their way back to their rooms, Sarah paused, looking back at the great hall. The spectral feast had been a haunting reminder of the castle's past, but it also served as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The ghosts of Castle Ravenswood had found peace, and in doing so, had allowed the living to reclaim their own. But as Sarah turned to follow the others, a faint whisper reached her ears. She looked back one last time, her heart pounding, but the great hall was empty. The ghosts were gone, their torment finally at an end. And with that, she felt a sense of closure, knowing that the castle's dark history had been laid to rest. The next morning, the group gathered in the courtyard, the relief of having survived the haunted feast tempered by a sense of urgency. The ritual had freed many spirits, but the castle's ominous atmosphere persisted. They agreed it was time to leave Castle Ravenswood behind. "We need to get out of here," Greg said, voicing what everyone was thinking. "Who knows what else this place has in store for us?" The guide nodded. "The castle's grip has weakened, but we must be cautious. Stay together and follow me." They made their way to the main gates, the heavy wooden doors that had seemed so imposing when they first arrived. As the guide reached for the latch, a gust of icy wind blew through the courtyard, slamming the door shut with a deafening boom. "Try again," Sarah urged, her voice edged with panic. The guide struggled with the latch, but it refused to budge. The gates seemed fused together by an invisible force, trapping them inside. A sense of dread settled over the group as they realized the castle wasn't ready to let them go. "We'll find another way out," Tom said, trying to sound confident. "There must be other exits." They split into smaller groups to search the castle, exploring every nook and cranny. Sarah and Tom headed toward the east wing, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. The air grew colder as they ventured deeper into the castle, and the walls seemed to close in around them. "Do you think the spirits are still here?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom shook his head. "I don't know, but we have to keep moving." They reached a narrow staircase leading down to the cellar. The air was damp and musty, and the dim light from their flashlights barely penetrated the darkness. As they descended, the temperature dropped even further, and Sarah shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a heavy iron door. Tom pushed it open with a creak, revealing a long, narrow tunnel. The air was thick with dust, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. "This has to lead somewhere," Tom said, stepping into the tunnel. They walked in silence, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever. Sarah's sense of unease grew with each step. Suddenly, a faint light appeared at the end of the tunnel. They quickened their pace, hope rising in their chests. But as they approached the light, they realized it was coming from a small, barred window set into a heavy wooden door. Tom tried the handle, but the door was locked. He peered through the bars, his face falling as he saw what lay beyond. The tunnel had led them back to the dungeon. "This can't be happening," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "We're going in circles." Tom banged on the door in frustration, but it was no use. They turned back, retracing their steps through the tunnel. As they walked, the walls seemed to close in, and the air grew colder still. Back in the castle, they found the others gathered in the great hall, their faces pale with fear and frustration. Every exit they had tried was either locked or led them back to where they started. The castle was playing tricks on them, its labyrinthine corridors shifting and changing to keep them trapped. "We have to find the guide," Sarah said. "He might know another way out." They searched the castle, calling out for the guide, but there was no response. The air grew heavier, and the sense of dread intensified. It was as if the castle itself was alive, its ancient stones whispering secrets and threats. As they regrouped in the great hall, a chilling laugh echoed through the room. The temperature plummeted, and a figure appeared in the shadows. It was the warden, his gaunt face twisted into a cruel smile. "You cannot escape," he hissed, his voice a raspy whisper. "This castle is my domain, and you are mine." The group backed away, their fear palpable. The warden's spectral form seemed to grow larger, his eyes burning with malice. "Stay together," Tom said, his voice shaking. "We have to fight back." The warden lunged at them, his ghostly hands reaching out. The group scattered, dodging his grasp. Sarah grabbed a nearby candlestick and swung it at the warden, but her hand passed through his form as if he were made of smoke. The warden laughed, his form flickering and distorting. "You are weak," he taunted. "You cannot defeat me." As the warden advanced, Sarah remembered the letters and the diary. "We need to finish the ritual," she said, her voice filled with determination. "It's the only way to break his hold." Tom nodded, grabbing the diary from his bag. The group gathered in a circle, their hands joined, and began to recite the incantations from the diary. The air hummed with energy, and the warden's form flickered, his cruel smile fading. "No!" the warden screamed, his voice echoing through the hall. "You cannot banish me!" The incantations grew louder, their voices filled with resolve. The warden writhed in agony, his form disintegrating into nothingness. With a final anguished scream, he vanished, leaving the room in an eerie silence. The air grew warmer, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The castle's hold on them had been broken. "We did it," Sarah said, her voice filled with relief. "He's gone." The group exchanged weary smiles, their fear giving way to a sense of accomplishment. They had faced the warden and won. As they made their way back to the main gates, they found them unlocked and slightly ajar. The castle, it seemed, was finally letting them go. They stepped out into the courtyard, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. The castle loomed behind them, its ancient stones silent once more. Sarah took one last look at Castle Ravenswood, a sense of closure settling over her. The horrors they had faced were behind them, and the castle's dark history had been laid to rest. They had survived, and they were free. As the group stood in the courtyard, feeling the first rays of dawn warm their faces, a sense of cautious relief washed over them. The castle's oppressive grip seemed to have loosened, but the sense of unfinished business lingered. Their guide, who had been inexplicably absent during their desperate escape attempts, reappeared, his face pale and drawn. "There's one final task," he said, his voice heavy with fatigue. "We must confront the spirits of the castle's former rulers in the throne room. Only then can we truly be free." The group exchanged wary glances but nodded. They had come this far, and there was no turning back. The guide led them through the castle's twisting hallways to the grand throne room, its doors towering and foreboding. The room was immense, with high ceilings adorned with faded frescoes and stained glass windows that cast eerie, multicolored patterns on the stone floor. At the far end of the room stood a dais with two grand thrones, their once opulent decorations tarnished by time. As they entered, the temperature dropped, and the air grew thick with a palpable sense of dread. Shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and the whispers of long-dead voices echoed through the hall. "The spirits of Lord and Lady Ravenswood," the guide said, pointing to the thrones. "They were the rulers of this castle and the source of its many horrors. We must confront them and reveal the truth." As if summoned by his words, the spectral forms of Lord and Lady Ravenswood materialized on the thrones. Lord Ravenswood was a tall, imposing figure, his eyes cold and unyielding. Lady Ravenswood, by contrast, had a sorrowful, haunted expression, her ethereal form shimmering in the dim light. "You dare to challenge us?" Lord Ravenswood's voice boomed, filled with both anger and incredulity. "This castle is ours, and so are the souls within it." "We seek the truth," the guide said, stepping forward. "You have tormented these halls for centuries. It's time to face your crimes." Lady Ravenswood's form flickered, and she looked away as if unable to bear the confrontation. Lord Ravenswood, however, rose from his throne, his spectral form towering over the group. "Truth," he spat, his voice dripping with disdain. "You know nothing of the truth." Sarah stepped forward, holding the diary and the letters they had found. "We know you were responsible for Isabella's death," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Your own daughter." Lady Ravenswood's ghostly form began to sob, her cries echoing through the throne room. Lord Ravenswood's expression darkened, and the air crackled with tension. "You know nothing," he roared, advancing on Sarah. "You meddle in affairs beyond your understanding." The guide stepped between Sarah and the advancing specter, raising his hands. "You cannot hide from your sins, Lord Ravenswood. The truth is out, and your reign of terror ends now." A powerful gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles and plunging the throne room into darkness. The group's flashlights flickered as the temperature plummeted further. "We must perform the final ritual," the guide shouted over the howling wind. "Join hands and recite the incantations from the diary." The group formed a circle, their hands clasped tightly together as they began to chant the ancient words. The air hummed with energy, and the spectral forms of Lord and Lady Ravenswood writhed in agony. "Enough!" Lord Ravenswood bellowed, his form flickering and distorting. "You will not banish us!" But their voices grew stronger, the incantations filling the throne room with a powerful light. Lady Ravenswood's sobs turned to screams as her form began to dissolve, her sorrow giving way to relief as she faded into the light. Lord Ravenswood's form twisted and contorted, his expression one of pure rage. "You will pay for this!" he screamed, but his words were drowned out by the chanting. With a final anguished cry, Lord Ravenswood's ghostly form disintegrated, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as he vanished into the light. The wind died down and the temperature began to rise, the throne room returning to its former silent state. The group stood in stunned silence, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The spectral rulers were gone, their dark presence banished. "We did it," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with awe and relief. "It's over." The guide nodded, a weary smile on his face. "The castle's curse is broken. The spirits are free, and so are we." As they made their way out of the throne room, the castle seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, its dark history finally laid to rest. The oppressive shadows lifted, and the ancient walls seemed to glow with a newfound warmth. They stepped out into the courtyard, the morning sun casting a golden light over the castle. For the first time, Castle Ravenswood looked less like a place of horror and more like a relic of the past, its dark secrets finally revealed. Sarah took a deep breath, the fresh air filling her lungs. They had faced the castle's darkest secrets and emerged victorious. As they walked away from Castle Ravenswood, a sense of closure settled over them. The horrors they had faced would never be forgotten. They had brought peace to the restless spirits and to themselves. And with that, they left the castle behind, knowing that its haunted halls would no longer torment the living or the dead. The morning sun bathed Castle Ravenswood in a soft, golden light, casting long shadows that danced across the courtyard. The group stood outside the castle gates, feeling the weight of the past days lift from their shoulders. They had survived the terrors within, but there was one final task that remained, the ritual to ensure the spirits were truly freed and to safeguard themselves from any lingering curse. The guide gathered them in a circle near the old well in the courtyard, its crumbling stones covered in moss. He held the ancient diary in his hands, the pages worn and fragile, yet imbued with a sense of power. "This final ritual," the guide began, "will either liberate the spirits entirely or bind them to this place forever. We must be precise and resolute. There can be no hesitation." The group nodded, their expressions a mix of determination and fear. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine as the guide lit a circle of candles around them, the flames flickering in the gentle breeze. "Place your hands on the diary," the guide instructed, opening it to the final page. "Recite the words together, and focus on your intent to free the spirits and protect ourselves." They placed their hands on the diary, feeling the cool leather beneath their fingers. The guide began to chant the ancient incantation, his voice steady and rhythmic. The group joined in, their voices blending together in a harmonious cadence that echoed through the courtyard. As they chanted, the air grew thick with energy, and a soft glow enveloped them. The candles' flames burned brighter, casting a warm light that seemed to push back the shadows. Sarah felt a strange sensation, as if the very essence of the castle was shifting around them. The guide's voice rose, leading them through the final lines of the incantation. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, and a low, resonant hum filled the air. The energy reached a crescendo, and with a final powerful utterance, the ritual was complete. For a moment there was silence. The group stood still, their breaths held in anticipation. Then, slowly, the glow began to fade, and the courtyard returned to its tranquil state. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over Castle Ravenswood was gone, replaced by a sense of peace and quiet. The guide closed the diary, a look of relief on his face. "It is done," he said softly. "The spirits are free." A collective sigh of relief passed through the group. They had done it. They had faced the horrors of the castle, uncovered its darkest secrets, and freed the tormented souls within. As they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, Sarah took one last look at the castle. It no longer seemed like a place of terror, but rather a solemn monument to the past, its haunted history finally laid to rest. They walked down the winding path that led away from Castle Ravenswood, the morning sun casting a warm glow over the landscape. The group was quiet, each lost in their thoughts, reflecting on the harrowing experiences they had shared. "Do you think it's really over?" Tom asked, his voice breaking the silence. Sarah nodded, squeezing his hand. "I think so. We did what we came here to do. The castle's curse is broken." The guide, walking slightly ahead, turned to face them. "You have all shown great courage," he said. "Castle Ravenswood will always be a place of history, but its dark chapter has ended. You can leave here knowing you made a difference." As they reached the end of the path, the castle now a distant silhouette, Sarah felt a sense of closure. They had faced unimaginable horrors and emerged stronger for it. The memories of their ordeal would stay with them, but so too would the knowledge that they had brought peace to a place long haunted by its past. They parted ways, each returning to their own lives, forever changed by the events at Castle Ravenswood. Sarah and Tom walked hand in hand, their bond strengthened by the trials they had endured together. As they drove away, the castle disappeared from view, and with it, the lingering shadows of its tormented history. The road ahead was bright and open, a stark contrast to the darkness they had left behind. And in that moment, they knew they had not only liberated the spirits of Castle Ravenswood, but had also freed themselves from the grip of fear and uncertainty. They were no longer the haunted visitors, but survivors who had faced the unknown and triumphed. The legacy of Castle Ravenswood would live on, but its haunted halls would trouble the living no more. The spirits were at peace, and so were they.